Alright, hey guys, this is just going to be a review of the material for Exam 3. So Exam 3 is going to cover the material on conformity and groups. So with conformity, we know that that is just changing our behavior based on the influence of other people, and that our culture influences us a great deal, right? So we have things like individualistic versus a collectivist culture. We have social norms where our culture tells us how to behave, and we tend to go along with that a lot. However, in our society, an individualistic society, we are a little bit less likely to conform versus individuals in a collectivist society being a little bit more likely to conform. Informational social influence is the idea that we go along with other people because we see them as a source of information, so we feel like they know better than us. So typically this results in private acceptance, which means that truly deep down we believe that they are right. That's why we're going along with them. And we talked about an example of mass psychogenic illness with the students in the high school with the poison gas, which there really was no gas. But the students thought that there was because the teacher said so. So in that situation, it was informational social influence that causes mass psychogenic illness. So if someone that you see as an expert starts some kind of panic, then other people are likely to go along with it, even to the point of having physical symptoms, right? So people tend to do this when it's an ambiguous situation, when it's a crisis, and when they see that person as an expert. So they think that that person has good information. Normative social influence, on the other hand, is the idea that we are going along because we want to be accepted. And so here, it doesn't necessarily result in private acceptance. It typically results in public compliance. What this means is that people go along because they want to fit in. They don't necessarily think it's the right thing to do, though. With private acceptance, you genuinely internally think that it's the right thing to do. That doesn't usually happen with normative social influence. Typically, you just have that public compliance where outwardly you go along with it, even though internally you might not agree. So we gave examples here of fashion trends, body image. We talked about, for example, that what we think is the ideal female body type changes over time, and it has a lot to do with the food supply and the culture, for example. This is where social norms come in, those rules that society teaches us. Impact of group size. We talked about how the more people there are, the more likely we are to conform up until a point, up until, 4 or 5. So a group of 5 is going to be a lot more influential than a group of 2. But beyond that, after there's 5 or so people, it doesn't really get much more difficult to resist conformity, probably because there's somebody else in the group that agrees with us, or because we don't interact with all of those people. And when we talked about Supreme Court decisions here, we said typically we have 9 judges, and so the least common situation is to have like 8-to-1, where there's one person that disagrees with everyone else, right? Ash's line study, we talked about how people were basically giving obviously wrong answers just because everyone else was. So this was normative social influence, and people were going along because they thought maybe they would offend someone else if they spoke up and said that they were wrong. They thought that maybe perhaps there was something about the situation that they just didn't understand, but they didn't want to be the only person that got the answer wrong. Versus, if I go along with everybody else and we all get the answer wrong, that's okay. I don't want to be the only person that gets it wrong, right? So this usually resulted in public compliance, but not private acceptance. So out loud, they went along with what people said, but internally, they didn't actually believe the other people were right. So ways to decrease conformity. For example, with this task, if you let people write down their answers, they usually won't go along with the group as much as they would if their answers are out loud or their answers are obvious, right? Obedience, we talked about Milgram's study about how Milgram was looking at how people would obey an authority figure. So he used deception to convince people to take part in the study, where they thought that they were electrocuting someone else. Of course, they were not. It was deception. But the idea was that the vast majority of people, something like 62.5% of people, went so far as to kill a stranger just because someone told them to. And because there is a competing norm here where we feel like it's important for us to obey, we are taught to obey authority figures, and we see this person as a researcher, we think that they are an authority figure, that they know what they're doing, and people tend to go along with that. So decreasing obedience, if it was a person who was not an expert doing the task, people didn't go along with it. If there were other Confederate, or other people who were Confederates, but they were pretending to be participants who said, I'm not doing this, I'm out of here, then the true participant was more likely to drop out. Or if the experts disagreed with each other, right? So all these things decreased obedience. And then the groups lecture, we talked about how a group has to be at least 2 people, but usually more, and they have to interact and need each other in some way. We talked about how groups give us our identity, how they give us these social roles that we'll talk about, and how they give us information, how they give us our social norms, and how typically if it's a large group we break into subgroups because we're not able to interact with everyone in that group. So our social roles are just what people expect of us based on our group, whatever our role is in the group. We talked about an example of this with the Stanford prison study about how people were randomly assigned to be either a guard or a prisoner, and how they very quickly assumed those roles to the point where the guards became abusive and the prisoners became depressed, and so they had to stop the study early. So this tells us that the expectations of other people influence us a great deal. Group cohesiveness, we said, is a situation where the group feels very close to each other, they all like each other, they all want to be part of the group. This benefits performance if you have that I don't want to let my team down mentality, but it can be a problem if it causes groups to make bad decisions just so they don't offend people. Social facilitation is the idea that when other people are watching us, we tend to change our behavior, either our performance gets better or worse. Social facilitation is going to help someone who is doing a simple task, or if they have a lot of experience so they're an expert at it. It's going to hurt someone doing a complex task, or someone who maybe is a novice, or somebody who's new to the task and doesn't quite know what they're doing. Social loafing is the idea that when we're in a group and nobody can tell our particular contribution, then we don't try as hard. And so we talked about, for example, with group projects, people who feel like somebody in the group will step up and take up the slack. We said that this happens more in males versus females, and that it happens more in individualistic cultures versus collectivist cultures. Group polarization is the idea that we tend to have a stronger belief if everyone around us agrees with us. Because, for example, they give us arguments that we've never thought of before, and because when everybody else agrees with us, that feels really good, and that gives us a reinforcement. So then, if you're in a group of people who agree with you, you will actually start to hold that opinion even more strongly. Deindividuation is the idea that if we're in a group and we feel like we are not going to be held individually accountable, we might do something like, for example, bullying other people or mobbing someone at a sports event just because we feel like we're not going to get into trouble. We talked about like cyberbullying, about anonymous posts on the internet. So people who feel like they won't be held accountable will do things that they would never do if they were going to be held accountable. Groupthink is just the idea that cohesiveness is more important than accuracy. So when you're in a group, if everyone is afraid of upsetting the status quo, then they might go along with a poor decision. So you can avoid this by having anonymous opinions, so letting people vote anonymously, having an impartial leader, bringing in other people who have other perspectives. It tends to happen most when you have a directive leader, so kind of a dictator situation, or when you're isolated from other people's opinions, so maybe you don't know how other people feel about it or why they feel that way. So it tends to happen in situations where the group is very cohesive. So the idea is that you need to bring in other potential opinions so that people can let you see all sides of things, right? And then finally, leadership. The great person theory doesn't have a ton of support for it, but the great person theory is the idea that personality traits are what makes someone a good leader. There is a correlation between certain personality traits and leadership, like, for example, intelligence and social skills and confidence and that kind of thing. But it's a weak correlation, so it's not terribly predictive. So you have to keep that in mind. And we talked about how it is difficult for women to gain a position of authority, because we typically see women as more of a nurturer rather than a leader. And so if a woman is being a leader, then we think that she's not being feminine. On the other hand, if a woman is being feminine, then she's not being a leader. So sometimes those things are seen as being mutually exclusive. And then if a woman does somehow become a leader, then she might be put in a position that is precarious, because people might think that she is able to handle relationship issues more than men would. So that was just a really brief review. If you have any questions as you're studying, I would be happy to help you guys. I do have office hours, so feel free to come by or email me or call me on my office phone during my office hours. So just let me know if you need anything, and I will talk to you guys next week.